Thank you very much, and thanks also to Connor and Holly for setting the stage here so I can pretty much get on with it without providing too much background. What my intention is today is to try to tease apart some data and try to recognize the relationship between water quality parameters in Otsego Lake and changes in the zooplankton community which are attributable to these fisheries changes that we've seen over the last couple decades. So real quick, Otsego Lake, fairly deep lake, mean depth is about 23 meters, max is about 50 meters. We have a pretty good data set that goes back for a couple decades, not prior to that, but it's very worth noting that the native cold water fisheries included lake whitefish and lake trout, and the fact that they've existed for millennia indicates that Otsego Lake has always been on the fairly oligotrophic side of things. It has a well-oxygenated hypolimnion, so at the very least we know that historically. Historically, the lake has been considered chemically mesotrophic. That means the nutrient concentrations are such that you would expect a relatively high production of algae, though it's been biologically oligotrophic. Despite the fact that the nutrients are high, we've seen low levels of chlorophyll A, fairly high levels of high transparencies, and only moderate oxygen losses. I'm not sure why these are not coming up in order. Probably some last minute edits I did. Sorry. I'm not sure what's going on here. Those conditions were attributed to having an efficient, highly efficient grazing population of large-bodied crustacean zooplankton. And you probably know what players I'm talking about, but we have probably most importantly cladosterians, which are one of their crustacean plankton groups, Daphnia, which tend to be very large-bodied and efficient grazers, as opposed to Bosmina, they're much smaller-bodied relative. Usually, one or the other of these groups is making up the majority of the cladosterian community. To a lesser degree, as far as importance of grazing, we have a bunch of different copepods, which are tend to be smaller, though oftentimes more numerous. And we have a diversity of rotifers, which can provide food source for some smaller fish species, but we don't think that they play a real big role as far as grazing goes. What I like to call the Godfrey prophecy. We had a limnologist in the mid-70s doing work on Otsego Lake, and he looked at nutrient concentrations, chlorophyll A, dominant algae species, the plankton community, physical parameters such as oxygen, and he said that Otsego Lake seems to be much more oligotrophic than its chemistry would make it seem, and contributed that to a nice population of efficient planktonores, and he said if something, efficient zooplankton, and he said if something was to happen to that community, Otsego Lake would probably appear to decline. About a decade later, enter the Albright, again, an illegally stocked forage fish. These are not coming out in the order that they were intended to. So my intention today, again, is to evaluate the influence of varying plankton communities on second transparencies and aerial oxygen, hypolimnitic oxygen demand. Second transparency is a nice parameter to look at because everybody can understand it. It's really easy. Though it's really more of a secondary index. What I like to use more is AHOD, or aerial hypolimnitic oxygen demand, which is really a measure of how much oxygen is lost in the hypolimnion over the course of summer stratification. And one thing that's really important to recognize as I go through these slides is that the zooplankton community that grazes effectively is expected to increase transparency and to decrease AHOD, okay? They're grazing the algae so the water's clearer, and those algae do not then have the opportunity to sink, die, and decompose, which uses up oxygen. So this graph looks a lot like the one that Holly show, except it's a lot nicer. So I'm relating all the transparencies we've had over time with those years where we have measures of AHOD. And you can see early on, there's a lot of variability in transparency. When you have the introduction of a fish, whether it's accidental or illegal like the alewife, or an intentional one like walleye, it takes a few years for those abundances to get high enough to make a difference in the lake. One thing that you might notice is that AHOD and transparency are pretty tightly correlated. And if we focus on the years, the more recent years where we have complete data sets for both parameters, you do a regression on those and you get an R-square of 0.82. So they're pretty tightly correlated. And again, you see increases in AHOD after the alewife introduction, and as transparency declines, then you see that reversing as walleye become more abundant and they control the alewife abundance. And then the zebra mussels kind of confound things and certainly contribute to increased transparencies and decreased AHODs. You look at the AHODs and you see a difference from the lowest year to the highest years by about a factor of 2, okay, which might not seem a whole lot. It is, it's a huge difference, and I want to illustrate that. The year with the lowest AHOD was last year, and if one looks at the fall oxygen profile, which is a lot easier to get your head around, you can see that all the hypolumnion, which is from about 15 meters down, it's pretty well oxygenated. It's 8 or 9 milligrams per liter right down to 40 meters, and then you see it tail off to a low of about 5. If one was charged with maintaining this lake for a cold water fishery, you would think, wow, it's a piece of cake because there's tons of well oxygenated water down there. If you compare that to a year where the AHOD was higher, and this is only 7 or 8 years prior to that, or excuse me, 17 or 18 years prior to that, you would see quite a different situation. The water from 15 meters down is barely above 5 at the highest point. So by doubling AHOD, you have a situation where it's really getting pretty tenuous as far as maintaining lake trout habitat. Spent a lot of time mining through a lot of data, and what I came up with really was 3 different measurements explaining the plankton community, their mean size, mean density of crustaceans, and the dry weight of crustaceans. And relating that to transparency in AHOD, I'm going to use AHOD as an example because, again, I think that's a much more meaningful measure. That's really what's dictating the habitat availability of lake trout, but the same relationships do hold true for psychic transparency. So given what's been said so far, you would assume that if you have more crustacean plankton, you might have more grazing, more filtration, and therefore a lower AHOD, right? That kind of intuitively makes sense. So if one plots crustacean density versus AHOD, you do get quite a tight correlation, but it's the exact opposite of what I just suggested. Okay, when we have higher rates of oxygen depletion during those years where we have much higher densities of crustacean zooplankton. So kind of counterintuitive. Okay, well, if there's a big size difference, then that might explain it. So what if we do the same thing and relate dry weight, or the biomass of the crustaceans versus AHOD? Well, here we don't really get any meaningful correlation at all. So, years where you have higher crustacean biomass, we don't necessarily see lower AHODs. So the third relationship we can look at is the mean size of the cladosterids versus AHOD. And lo and behold, here you see a very tight correlation, and that is as the mean size of the cladosterids increases, you see much lower AHODs. And some of those years where the cladosterid mean size is largest are actually those years where densities are lowest and dry weights are lowest. So really the bottom line here is that if you have some number, even if it's a fairly low number of large-bodied cladosterids, that is Daphnia, we have very low AHOD values. And I guess the main take-home message is that if one can manage the fishery in such a way that allows for the existence of these large-bodied Daphnia, you're going to do a really good job managing the physical nature of the lake. And this very often is a way to manage the lake in a much more or less expensive way than the conventional management tools, which involve nutrient reductions. So what about the zebra mussel situation? It's really, in my mind, kind of counterintuitive, and I don't understand all that there is going on. There's some things that are really surprising to me. Zebra mussels, again, came in 2008, and we were starting to see the trophic changes that we would have hoped to before the establishment of mussels. We were seeing increased transparencies, decreased chlorophyll A, lower rates of AHOD, so that means lower or higher summer oxygen concentrations in the hypolimnion. So we were seeing those things start to unfold before the establishment of mussels. It would have been great if the mussels hadn't been introduced, at least not as early as they had been, so we could have seen this story kind of play out before we got thrown in this big variable that we didn't expect. One thing that's really interesting in my mind is that following the establishment of zebra mussels, we saw much larger Daphnia in the water column than what we had. These, again, are the mean sizes over the course of the summer, but it was not uncommon to see Daphnia over 2 millimeters following the establishment of zebra mussels, which I found very interesting. And just to kind of show the same graph again, showing the relationship as far as the zebra mussels were introduced in '08. They weren't really abundant until 2010, 2011. And after that, we did see increases in transparency and the declines in AHOD that I described. And with that, are there any questions?